Thanksgiving was supposed to be a day of warmth, laughter, and family. My mother, Laura, had worked tirelessly to prepare the table. Roasted turkey golden on the outside, mashed sweet potatoes fragrant with cinnamon, and a pumpkin pie cooling on the windowsill. She always tried to make the holidays a moment where our broken family could find common ground, even if only for a night. But that year something hung in the air, something heavier than the scent of food. I felt it before anyone spoke, the unshakable chill of an approaching storm. We sat at the long dining table, the silk white cloth draped carefully across it, plates set with perfection. My father, Frank, sat at the head, replacing the seat that had once belonged to Grandpa Arthur. The contrast stung me. Where Grandpa once wore his simple plaid shirt, speaking with humility and laughter, my father now sat in a tailored suit, his gold watch glinting under the chandelier. My twin brother, Blake, was beside him, leaning in with excitement as if he already knew something I didn't. My mother moved quietly, trying to keep the atmosphere alive with gentle smiles, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. For a while, dinner was filled with the usual noise. Clinking cutlery, small talk, and Dad boasting about the new Baltimore branch. Blake echoed every word with admiration, nodding like a devoted disciple. I sat quietly, eating my turkey in silence, each word they exchanged piercing me deeper. I didn't join their vision of expansion, of frozen suppliers, of empire building. To me, all of it felt hollow, a betrayal of the very foundation Grandpa had built. Still, I stayed silent. That silence, however, didn't protect me from what was about to come. Halfway through the meal, my father lightly tapped his wineglass with a fork. The sound silenced the room, sharp and commanding. I looked up, and the expression on his face made my stomach knot. He wasn't about to share a story. He was about to deliver a verdict. "I have an important announcement," he said, his voice steady but loaded with weight. My mother froze mid-step as she was reaching for another dish, her hands trembling ever so slightly. Blake, on the other hand, grinned, his eyes shining with anticipation, as if he had been waiting for this moment all night. I tightened my grip on my fork, bracing myself. My father's words cut through the air like a blade. "As you know, the Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar is no longer just one restaurant. It is an empire, and I've decided it's time to think about the future, about who will take over when I am gone." The world seemed to slow. My pulse quickened. I didn't know why, but something inside me screamed that this was about to change everything. My mother's eyes flicked toward me with a look of dread, as though she already knew what was coming. Blake leaned back confidently, waiting to be crowned. "I've made my decision," Dad continued. His eyes shifted toward Blake, locking onto him like a proud general choosing his successor. "The entire estate, the restaurants, the business, everything, will be left to Blake." The words slammed into me like a fist to the chest. For a moment, the room was silent. My mother gasped, setting her glass down with trembling hands. Blake clapped with delight, rising from his seat to hug Dad like a victor at the end of a race. "Thank you, Dad," he said proudly, as though he had just been anointed king. I sat frozen, staring at the plate in front of me, my appetite gone, my chest hollow. My father turned his gaze to me, his eyes cold, detached. "As for you, Wyatt," he said, his voice cutting and deliberate, "you won't inherit anything. You only know how to resist. You cling to your grandfather's outdated ideas. You have no vision, no understanding of usiness. I can't entrust this empire to someone who refuses to see its value." Each word was a dagger. For 6 years I had endured. The mockery, the dismissals, the way they twisted Grandpa's dream into something unrecognizable. And now here it was. Final, official, brutal. My father had not just chosen Blake. He had erased me. My mother's voice cracked as she pleaded, "Frank, you can't do this to Wyatt. He's your son, too. But Dad dismissed her with a shake of his head. This is for the good of the family, he said firmly. Blake is our future. I pushed my chair back, the sound screeching across the floor. The room spun. My mother called my name, her voice breaking with desperation. But I couldn't stay there another second. I looked at my father, then at Blake, who still smirked with triumph, and finally at my mother, whose eyes brimmed with tears. I don't belong here anymore, I said, my voice steady though my insides burned. And with that, I walked out, leaving behind not just a dinner, but an entire chapter of my life. When I walked out of that Thanksgiving dinner, the sting of my father's words followed me like a shadow. But if there was one thing that kept me from crumbling, it was the memory of my grandfather, Arthur Dawson. He was the anchor of my childhood, the man whose steady hands and steady heart built the foundation I still clung to. Long before inheritance and betrayal, there were mornings in Norfolk when the world felt simpler. Mornings where Grandpa's lessons seeped into my soul, one small moment at a time. I grew up in the salty air of the Chesapeake Bay, where the scent of grilled oysters mingled with the sound of gulls. But the strongest memory isn't of the ocean. It's of riding in the back of Grandpa's battered pickup truck at dawn. The radio crackled old country songs, and he hummed along, his voice low and warm. The sky would just be waking, soft streaks of pink and orange stretching above us, and there I was, the boy watching a man who seemed larger than life. To me, he wasn't just my grandfather, he was my hero. Grandpa built the Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar from nothing. No fancy investors, no shortcuts, just sweat, stubbornness, and heart. He used to say, "What a reputation is worth more than gold. You can lose money and make it back. But once people stop trusting you, you have lost everything." At 8 years old, I barely understood, but his words sank in like seeds, waiting for the day they'd grow. He took me everywhere with him. Farmers' markets weren't errands to him. They were lessons. He refused to buy from big distributors, no matter how cheap they were. "Those companies don't care about people," he'd say, squatting down to inspect tomatoes with the care of a jeweler examining diamonds. "But these farmers, they pour their sweat into every seed. You respect that." I still remember Joe, the sweet potato farmer. One year, floods destroyed his crops, leaving him with barely enough to cover costs. Without hesitation, Grandpa bought every crate Joe had left. We couldn't use it all, and Grandpa knew it. But he didn't care. "Sometimes, Wyatt, helping others is helping yourself," he told me with a pat on the shoulder. That simple act wasn't just charity. It was proof that business was more than profit margins. It was about people. The farmers adored him. They'd shake his hand like they were greeting a lifelong friend. He knew their kids' names, their struggles, their triumphs. And he taught me something strange for a kid, to look a person in the eye. "If they can't meet your gaze, don't trust them," he said. It sounded old-fashioned, but over time I realized he was right. A handshake, an honest glance, these were his contracts. Inside the restaurant, Grandpa was everywhere at once. He poured beers at the bar, checked ribs sizzling on the grill, and joked with customers like they were family. People didn't just come for food. They came for Arthur. They came for warmth. Even on nights when the place was packed, when laughter and clinking cutlery filled the air, he carried himself with calm. I'd sit at the corner of the counter sipping a soda, watching him move like a conductor orchestrating harmony. He never bragged, never played the part of a big man, but he had a fire in him. He'd tell me stories of the early days, how banks turned him away, how he borrowed money from friends, how he slept on the kitchen floor to save time. He'd look at me, eyes sparkling, and say, "Wyatt, when you believe in something with your whole heart, nothing's impossible." I didn't know then how much I'd need those words. Grandpa wasn't just about business. He taught through kindness. One of the waitresses, Maria, fell ill for weeks. Most owners would have cut her pay or found a replacement. But Grandpa kept paying her salary, visited her in the hospital, and left her a basket of fruit with a handwritten note. "We're family," he told me when I asked why, "and family doesn't abandon each other." The kitchen became my training ground. I still remember the day he taught me how to grill a steak. I was 12, standing nervously in front of the roaring fire. Too hot, it burns. Too cool, it's tough. Life's the same, Wyatt. Balance is everything. My forehead dripped with sweat, but when that steak came off the grill, perfectly seared, I felt like I'd earned a badge of honor. That wasn't just cooking. That was Grandpa passing me the torch. I spent my childhood in his orbit, soaking up every lesson. He wasn't just teaching me how to run a restaurant. He was teaching me how to live with integrity, how to see people as more, either numbers, how to chase dreams without losing your soul. And then one autumn morning when I was 19, he was gone. He passed in his sleep, quiet and dignified, leaving a hole so deep I didn't know how to fill it. I stood outside the restaurant staring at the sign that bore his name, gripping the key he'd given me, wishing holding it could keep him alive. That day, it felt like the world dimmed. Looking back, I realized every smile he gave me, every word he spoke was a gift for the future. When Dad dismissed me as clinging to outdated ideas, he wasn't just insulting me. He was insulting Arthur, the man whose values built everything we had. That's why I couldn't let go. That's why, even when stripped of inheritance, I carried Arthur's lessons like a burning torch inside me. They weren't outdated. They were timeless. After Grandpa passed, I naively believed my father would step into his shoes and carry the flame forward. I thought the restaurant that had been built with sweat, trust, and community would remain the same. But within months, the Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar transformed into something I hardly recognized. What had once been a living, breathing legacy became a machine driven by numbers, charts, and ambition. My father, Frank Dawson, wasn't like Grandpa. He didn't care for early mornings at the farmer's market, for shaking hands with Joe the sweet potato farmer, or smelling a fish to see if it was fresh. To him, that was inefficient, a waste of time. "It's a new era, Wyatt," he told me the first time I questioned him. "We can't run a business like housewives shopping at a market. We need efficiency, scale." Efficiency, in his world, meant frozen food shipments arriving on semi-trucks from thousands of miles away. Gray sardines packed in plastic bags, vegetables stripped of life, steaks wrapped in layers of industrial packaging, thawed out hours before serving. "Cheaper, faster, better margins," Dad said smugly, tapping the glossy revenue charts pinned to his office wall. I tried to argue. "Customers will notice. Grandpa's customers aren't fools." Dad laughed, shaking his head. "People don't care, Wyatt. They want a full plate and a fair price. That's all, but they did care. I saw it in their eyes, in the way regulars who had been dining with us for decades pulled me aside. Margaret, one of Grandpa's most loyal customers, looked me straight in the eye one evening. "Wyatt, why do the ribs taste different? They're not like Arthur's." I had no answer, only an apology that felt hollow. It felt like betrayal. The staff noticed too. Henry, the head chef, who had been with Grandpa since the beginning, sighed as he tossed frozen steaks onto the grill. "Times have changed, Wyatt," he muttered, though his eyes told a different story. Disappointment, resignation, maybe even shame. And yet, in the eyes of the world, Dad was a success. Within 2 years of taking over, profits soared. He opened new branches in Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, and Newport News. Local newspapers hailed him as a visionary. Magazine covers showed him in expensive suits, smiling confidently, the headline calling him the man who turned Dawson Grill into a regional empire. Every time I saw those headlines, it felt like a knife twisting deeper. They praised him for growth, but they didn't see the rot underneath. They didn't taste the rubbery steak or the bland seafood. They didn't see the farmers, Men and women who had once stood proudly beside Grandpa, now cut out of the picture, left behind in favor of nameless suppliers overseas. Blake, my twin, couldn't get enough of it. He idolized Dad's every move. "Dad's a genius," he told me once, grinning as we sat in the living room watching Dad boast about his new yacht. "Grandpa worked his whole life for one little place. Dad's taken us to the next level." I wanted to shout at him, to shake him awake, to tell him that this next level was a castle built on sand. But Blake was blinded by the glitter, the cars, the vacations, the spotlight. To him, Dad wasn't betraying a legacy. He was creating history. Family dinners turned into battlegrounds. Mom tried to bring up old stories about Grandpa, hoping to keep his warmth alive at the table, but Blake would cut her off, eager to brag about Dad's expansion plans. "We'll be in Richmond next, then D.C., he'd say with pride. I'd sit there silent, choking on my food, feeling like I was mourning something that no one else even realized had died. The worst moment came when Dad himself belittled Grandpa. One night, as I cautiously suggested we return to buying from local farmers, he leaned back and scoffed. Arthur was a good man, but he was outdated. If we'd stuck to his ways, we'd still be a small-time joint in Norfolk. His time is over. His time is over. The words echoed in my head, sharp and merciless. I clenched my fists under the table, my blood boiling. To him, Grandpa wasn't a hero or a pioneer. He was a relic. That was the moment I realized Dad wasn't just steering the business in a different direction. He was dismantling everything Arthur Dawson had stood for. On paper, Dawson Grill was thriving. In reality, it was hollow. The laughter in the dining room grew thinner. The food tasted flat. The warmth that once radiated from every corner had been replaced by cold efficiency. It wasn't the Dawson Grill anymore. It was something else entirely, something unrecognizable. And I, sitting in the middle of it all, felt powerless. I was too young, too inexperienced, too ignored. My voice was drowned out by profit margins and expansion charts. But deep inside, I knew the truth. This empire wasn't built to last. Anything built on shortcuts, on arrogance, on betrayal, it always collapses. It was only a matter of time. Blake and I shared the same face, the same dark hair, the same blue Dawson eyes. But inside we were becoming strangers. Twins, yes, but never more divided than those years after Grandpa's death. Where I saw betrayal, Blake saw brilliance. Where I mourned the fading warmth of Dawson Grill, he celebrated the empire Dad was building. I had grown up at Grandpa's side, watching him shake farmers' hands and grill steaks with patience and care. Blake, on the other hand, had spent his youth chasing distractions. Sports, parties, anything but responsibility. He never cared much for the restaurant until Dad transformed it into something shiny. Suddenly, Blake couldn't get enough. He clung to Dad like a shadow, eager to inherit not just the business, but his approval. "Wyatt, you're stuck in the past," Blake told me once as we sat in the living room after dinner. Dad had just finished bragging about his new yacht, and Blake's eyes gleamed with admiration. "Grandpa's way was fine back then, but Dad's building history. Don't you see? He's turning us into something bigger." I shook my head, frustration rising in my chest. Bigger isn't better if it's rotten underneath. Customers notice. They already complain the food doesn't taste the same. This isn't history, Blake. It's a hollow show. He laughed, a cruel laugh that stung more than his words. "You sound like a dreamer. Business isn't about fairy tales and farmers. It's about money. Numbers don't lie." It was always like this. Every time I tried to defend Grandpa's values, Blake dismissed me with mockery. To him, I wasn't visionary. I was naive. My ideas of local suppliers and honest food were childish. He wanted expansion. He wanted glamour. He wanted Dad's approval, and he would trample over anything, even me, to get it. Family dinners became unbearable. Mom would try to soften the tension by sharing stories about Granddad. Pop, the time he taught me to pick tomatoes, or when he stayed up all night perfecting a sauce. I would smile faintly, grateful for the memory. But Blake would cut in, irritated. Enough with the fairy tales, Mom. That stuff doesn't matter anymore. We're running a business, not a farm stand. Each time my chest tightened and words burned on my tongue, but arguing only fed the fire. Dad would join Blake, mocking me, dismissing me, telling me I wasn't cut out for leadership. It became a ritual. Mom trying to bridge the gap, Blake glorifying Dad, and me shrinking into silence. But silence didn't mean acceptance. Inside, I felt a growing storm. Every sarcastic remark from Blake, every smirk when Dad praised him over me, every jab about me clinging to Grandpa's ways, all of it was fuel. I loved my brother once. We'd shared birthdays, secrets, even childhood pranks. But now it was as if Dad's empire had driven a wedge so deep between us that there was no way back. What cut deepest wasn't just Blake's loyalty to Dad. It was the way he reveled in my humiliation. In meetings, whenever Dad shot down my ideas, Blake would laugh the loudest. Whenever I suggested something, he'd interrupt, dripping sarcasm. Here we go again. Wyatt's fairy tale farming plan. The employees chuckled along, and I felt smaller and smaller. Looking back, I don't think Blake hated me. Not really. What he hated was the mirror I held up. The reminder that our success was built on betrayal, not brilliance. But instead of facing that truth, he doubled down, mocking me, dismissing me, and aligning himself with Dad. Brother against brother. It wasn't just rivalry. It was a fracture that cut through the heart of our family. And yet, part of me still hoped he would wake up one day, see the truth, and remember the lessons Grandpa once tried to pass to both of us. But the deeper he sank into Dad's shadow, the more I realized something painful. I had lost my brother, not to death, but to greed. Thanksgiving had always been my mother's favorite holiday. No matter how fractured the family felt, she tried to weave us together with food and tradition, like stitching torn fabric back into something whole. That year, she worked even harder. The silk tablecloth draped with care, the roasted turkey gleaming under the chandelier, side dishes lined like soldiers ready to impress. To her, maybe the meal was a chance to mend what had been unraveling for years. But I felt it from the moment I stepped into the dining room. Tension, sharp and heavy, like a storm pressing against the windows. My father sat at the head of the table, smug in his tailored suit, his gold watch flashing under the light. Blake sat beside him, practically buzzing, as though he already knew tonight was his coronation. My mother moved silently around the table, her smile brittle, her hands trembling as she poured wine. At first, dinner carried on like every other. Blake and Dad filled the room with talk of expansion, the Baltimore branch opening, whispers of North Carolina next. Every word from their mouths was like sandpaper against my chest. I cut my turkey in silence, trying to swallow both the food and the anger rising inside me. Then came the moment. Dad lightly tapped his glass with his fork. The ringing sound sliced through the chatter, commanding silence. My mother froze, a plate in her hand. Blake's grin widened, anticipation lighting up his face. I tightened my grip on my fork, my gut twisting. I have an important announcement, Dad began, his voice steady, deliberate. The Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar is no longer just a restaurant. It is an empire. And it's time I name the one who will carry it into the future. The room held its breath. My heart raced. For years I had fought, raising my voice in meetings, defending Grandpa's values, refusing to surrender to shortcuts. Maybe just maybe this was the moment he'd finally recognize my conviction. But his gaze never softened as it met mine. It was cold, dismissive, as though I wasn't even his son. Then he turned to Blake, his lips curling into a proud smile. "I've made my decision," he said firmly. "The entire estate, the restaurants, the company, every asset, will be left to Blake." The words detonated inside me. My chest turned to ice. My mother gasped, the plate slipping slightly in her hands before she steadied it. Blake erupted into applause, leaping from his chair to embrace Dad like a soldier decorated in front of his king. "Thank you, Dad," he exclaimed, his voice dripping with triumph. I sat frozen. The room blurred. All the years I had poured into protecting Grandpa's vision, the ideas mocked, the sacrifices made, the humiliation endured, none of it mattered. My father had erased me in a single sentence. Then, as if the knife wasn't already deep enough, he twisted it. "As for you, Wyatt," he continued, his voice sharp, his tone merciless, "you will inherit nothing. You only know how to resist. You cling to Arthur's outdated ways, ways that don't belong in this era. You have no vision, no understanding of real business. I cannot entrust my empire to someone who refuses to see its value." Each word struck like a hammer blow. My father wasn't just denying me an inheritance. He was dismissing everything I believed in, everything Grandpa had instilled in me. My mother's voice broke the silence. "Frank, you can't do this to Wyatt. He's your son, too." Her eyes brimmed with tears, her hands shaking as she tried to hold the family together with nothing but desperation. But Dad's head shook firmly. "This is for the good of the family. Blake is our future." Blake, still grinning, patted my shoulder as if offering comfort. His words were honey-coated poison. "Don't be upset, Wyatt. You can still work for the company. You're just not cut out to lead." That was it, the final fracture. In that moment, I saw my brother not as blood, but as an accomplice to betrayal. His smile wasn't brotherly. It was victory. My chair screeched as I pushed it back, this and jolting the room. My mother called out, "Wyatt, please sit down," her voice pleading, fragile. But I couldn't. Not anymore. I stood, my chest tight, but my voice calm, cold as stone. "I don't belong here anymore." I looked at each of them in turn, at Blake, smug in his triumph, at Dad, smug in his verdict, and at Mum, her eyes swimming with tears, powerless in the storm. "You've chosen your path," I said, my voice low, deliberate. "I won't walk it with you." And then I turned and walked out. Each step was heavy, but each step was also release. The cold air outside hit my face sharp against my skin, as if the world itself was trying to cleanse me of what I had just endured. I stood there for a moment, staring at the warm glow spilling from the windows of the house I no longer belonged to. That night, beneath the weight of betrayal, I made a vow. I would rebuild from the ground up. Not with Dad's shortcuts, not with Blake's blind arrogance, but with the heart Grandpa taught me to lead with. They could take the inheritance, they could take the company, but they could never take Arthur's lessons from me. The night I walked out of my father's house, I carried almost nothing with me. A few clothes stuffed into a bag, Grandpa's worn notebook filled with recipes and scribbled reminders like, "Do business with your heart," and the fire still smoldering in my chest. A fire lit by betrayal, but fueled by the memory of Arthur Dawson and everything he stood for. I rented a small room in Norfolk. It was barely more than 4 walls and a bed, but it became the birthplace of my resolve. I sat there with my near-empty bank account, staring at the ceiling, asking myself what came next. Dad had shut me out. Blake had laughed me off. My inheritance was gone. But somehow I felt lighter, freed from their shadows. For the first time in years, I wasn't chasing their approval. I was chasing my own path. The dream was simple but daunting. Build a restaurant that honored Grandpa, a place rooted in sincerity, local farmers, and fresh ingredients, not frozen shortcuts. But dreaming was easy. Execution was another matter. I had no capital, no connections, and now, thanks to Dad's growing influence, almost no allies in the industry. That's when I thought of Brittany. Brittany had been my friend since high school, a girl with golden hair, a quick laugh, and a quiet determination I had always admired. She had gone on to study at a prestigious culinary school and was working in Virginia Beach at the time. Years ago, we had once joked about opening a place together, me handling the business side, her running the kitchen. At the time, it was just teenage banter. But now, with everything stripped away, that dream didn't seem so silly anymore. I called her, my voice hesitant. "Britt, do you remember what you said back in school about opening a restaurant with me?" She didn't even pause. "Wyatt, I believe in you. If you're serious, I'm in." Those words were oxygen to a drowning man. Together, we began sketching the blueprint of what would become Arthur's Legacy Steakhouse. We wanted it small, intimate, grounded in community. A place where every ingredient had a story. Every meal carried integrity. Of course, belief alone couldn't pay the bills. We scraped together what we could. A modest bank loan, a few savings from Brittany, and every penny I could gather. It was barely enough to rent a tiny storefront in Norfolk, in the same neighborhood where Grandpa once shook hands with farmers at dawn. The early days were brutal. The kitchen was bare, our equipment secondhand, our shelves often close to empty. I reached out to local farmers, men like Joe who still remembered Grandpa, but most were hesitant. "Wyatt, we love you," Joe said, his voice heavy with regret. "But your father made things hard for us. He doesn't want us working with you." I wasn't surprised. Dad and Blake weren't content with ignoring me. They actively tried to crush me. Suppliers suddenly pulled out of deals. Rumors spread that Arthur's legacy was doomed before it began. More than once, I stood in the empty kitchen staring at barren shelves, wondering if I'd made a mistake. But every time doubt crept in, Brittany pulled me back. She was more than a chef. She was my partner in spirit. I can still see her on those long nights when we sat on the restaurant floor surrounded by crates of fresh produce, exhausted but smiling. "Wyatt, we're doing the right thing," she whispered one evening. "Your grandpa would be proud." And then there was Mom. Though she was still tied to Dad by name, her heart was with me. She would visit Arthur's legacy on her days off, bringing cookies, wiping down tables, even folding napkins just to help. "You're carrying his true legacy, Wyatt," she told me once, her eyes glistening. I think she knew she couldn't change Dad or Blake, but she could still stand beside me. Slowly, customers trickled in. At first, it was curiosity. People curious about the grandson of Arthur Dawson. But what brought them back wasn't my name. It was the food. Perfectly grilled steaks, salads made with vegetables delivered fresh that morning, bread toasted with care. Every plate told a story and customers could taste it. One evening, a customer leaned back from his plate, a smile stretching across his face. "This is the best ribs I've ever had," he said. Those words filled me with more pride than any headline about Dad's empire. Each compliment was a brick in our foundation. Slowly, Arthur's legacy was no longer just a dream. It was becoming real. But make no mistake, the road was still brutal. Some nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my tiny room, wondering how we'd make loan payments. Suppliers still backed out under Dad's pressure. Once, a Chesapeake Bay fish supplier called me apologetically. "I'm sorry, Wyatt. Frank's a big player. I can't risk it." My blood boiled, but I swallowed it. Instead, Brittany and I drove hours out of town, knocking on doors, convincing farmers and fishermen one by one to give us a chance. Those were the hardest days of my life, but they were also the most defining. Because in those struggles, I discovered something powerful. My father could take my inheritance, but he couldn't take my will. Blake could mock me, but he couldn't erase the fire in my chest. Arthur's legacy wasn't just a restaurant, it was resistance. It was proof. Proof that Grandpa's way wasn't outdated, that integrity wasn't a weakness, that sincerity wasn't naive. We weren't just starting a restaurant. We were rebuilding a legacy from scratch. The first time Arthur's Legacy Steakhouse was packed, I stood frozen by the door, hardly able to believe what I was seeing. Tables full, laughter spilling across the room, the air alive with the sounds of clinking glasses and sizzling steaks. For months we had fought tooth and nail just to keep the lights on. But that night I felt something shift. Our little restaurant wasn't just surviving anymore, it was alive. It didn't happen overnight. At first, people came in out of curiosity. The grandson of Arthur Dawson opening his own place was enough to draw attention in Norfolk. But what brought them back wasn't my name. It was the food. Brittany's grilled steaks seared to perfection, salads bursting with pop, roast that had been picked that very morning, bread toasted golden brown and brushed with butter until the scent lingered in the air. Customers noticed the difference. They could taste the care. One man, a regular who'd once dined weekly at the old Dawson Grill, leaned back in his chair after finishing his ribs and said, "Wyatt, this feels like Arthur's place again." My chest swelled at those words. To hear Grandpa's name spoken with that kind of warmth was worth more than profit margins or headlines. And it wasn't just the customers who noticed. Slowly, familiar faces began walking through our doors. Not as diners, but as allies. Henry, the head chef who had been with Grandpa from the beginning, showed up one morning in a worn jacket. His eyes, once tired from years of frozen food monotony, were lit again with purpose. "Wyatt," he said simply, "I can't stay with your father anymore. What he's doing isn't what Arthur taught us. If you'll have me, I want to be here." I didn't hesitate. "Henry, I've been waiting for you." Then came Maria, the dishwasher who had once been treated like family by Grandpa when she fell ill. She left Dad's company quietly, her hands still warm from years of labor, and said, "You're like Arthur, Wyatt. You've got his heart. I want to be part of this again." Her words made my throat tighten. To her, I wasn't just Arthur's grandson. I was his continuation. One by one, more followed. Tom, who used to run the bar at Dawson Grill, showed up saying he couldn't stand the lifeless atmosphere under Dad anymore. They all returned not for money, not for prestige, but because they longed for something they once had with Grandpa. Sincerity, pride, family. Our small team was nothing like Dad's polished corporate staff. We didn't have expensive uniforms or shiny offices, but what we had was spirit. A shared fire that burned hotter than any empire Dad could build. With every new addition, Arthur's legacy grew stronger. Henry brought his expertise to the kitchen, shaping menus with Britain, that celebrated freshness. Maria became the heartbeat of the back end, working tirelessly and smiling the whole time. Tom breathed life into the bar, telling old stories of Arthur to customers who leaned in to listen. It wasn't just a restaurant anymore, it was a community. Weekends became chaos in the best possible way. Lines stretched out the door, customers waited eagerly, and the sound of chatter filled every corner. Brittany and I worked side by side. Me at the front greeting customers, her in the kitchen commanding the line. Sometimes we'd catch each other's eyes across the chaos and share a small smile. A silent reminder that we were building this together. The pressure was still immense. Bills didn't disappear, and Dad and Blake continued their quiet war against us. Suppliers were pressured, rumors spread, and whispers of failure still lingered. But now I wasn't standing alone in that fight. I had Brittany, I had my team, and most importantly, I had customers who believed in us. One night after closing, the restaurant still smelling of grilled meat and toasted bread, I stood by the wall where we had hung a framed photo of Grandpa Arthur. In it, he stood in front of the original Dawson Grill, silver hair glinting in the sun, eyes filled with resolve. I whispered quietly, "We did it, Grandpa. We brought it back." Arthur's legacy was no longer just a name painted on the door. It was alive, a beacon of the values he had lived by. Every handshake with a farmer, every smile to a customer, every lesson about doing business with heart. They weren't just memories anymore. They were our foundation. I realized then that this wasn't about competing with Dad or proving Blake wrong. It was about keeping alive the spirit of a man who believed that food wasn't just food. It was connection. It was sincerity. It was family. Arthur's legacy was born, and in its laughter, fly, vorge, and warmth. I heard my grandfather's voice again. While Arthur's legacy was finding its rhythm, whispers began to reach me about the state of my father's company. At first, I ignored them. I didn't want to care. I had my hands full running our little steakhouse, keeping customers happy, and paying bills that always seemed to come too soon. But the murmurs grew louder, and soon I couldn't deny the truth. Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar was crumbling. It started with the customers. Long-time regulars, the kind who once swore by Arthur's cooking, were voicing their disappointment. The steaks are tough, one told my mother when she bumped into him at the market. The seafood tastes off. Another complained the place felt cold and lifeless. Nothing like Arthur's time. These weren't just random critics. These were loyal patrons who had eaten at Dawson Grill since its opening day. If even they were turning away, something was deeply wrong. Then came the reviews. On food forums, Yelp, and TripAdvisor, words like cheap, tasteless, and heartless started popping up next to Dawson Grill's name. Customers described rubbery steaks, bland salads, and seafood that left a chemical aftertaste. I knew exactly why. Frozen imports, shortcuts, the very things I'd begged Dad to avoid years ago. One evening, Mom visited me at Arthur's Legacy after closing. She sat at the counter, her eyes heavy with worry. "Wyatt," she said quietly, "there's talk that the press is investigating your father's suppliers. People are saying the seafood from China isn't safe, that something shady is going on." I felt my stomach twist. Part of me wanted to say, good, he deserves it. But another part, the son who still remembered wanting his father's approval, just felt tired. I didn't want Dad and Blake to crash, not completely. Yet I knew they had set themselves on this path long ago. As the months passed, the cracks widened. Rumors spread faster than Frank could contain them. A reporter from the Norfolk Chronicle ran a piece questioning the chain's transparency, pointing to the vague sourcing labels on menus. Social media lit up with customers posting photos of gray-looking fish and comparing them to the vibrant, fresh dishes at Arthur's Legacy. The contrast was undeniable. Where Dawson Grill was seen as deceitful and soulless, Arthur's Legacy was celebrated as honest and heartfelt. Eleanor Price, a respected food critic, visited both restaurants and published a review that spread like wildfire. She didn't mince words. Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar has lost its way. Once a beloved local institution, it now serves lifeless food with questionable sourcing. In contrast, Arthur's Legacy Steakhouse, run by Arthur Dawson's grandson, has revived the true spirit of dining with sincerity and freshness. One has chosen profit over heart. The other proves that integrity is never outdated. Reading those words, I felt a flood of pride and sorrow all at once. Pride that Grandpa's philosophy was finally vindicated. Sorrow that the business he built had fallen so far. Meanwhile, Arthur's Legacy thrived. Customers lined up out the door. Farmers and fishermen who once worked with Grandpa now proudly supplied us again, shaking my hand with the same trust they once gave him. Brittany and I worked tirelessly, but every smile, every compliment reminded us we were building something real. Dad, on the other hand, was scrambling. Mom told me he had hired a PR firm to clean up the company's image, but the harder they tried, the worse it got. One article exposed falsified import certifications. Another revealed sanitation violations in several kitchens. The final blow came when a group of customers claimed they had gotten sick after eating at the Newport News branch. They posted online describing nausea and stomach pains, and soon a lawsuit was filed. The empire that had once seemed unstoppable was now collapsing under its own weight. The Chesapeake branch closed first, then Richmond. Newspapers that had once hailed Dad as a visionary now labeled him reckless. From legacy to disaster, one headline read. I saw it on a newsstand one morning and couldn't bring myself to pick it up. Mom came by again, her face pale. They're panicking, she said softly. Shareholders are pulling out. Customers are boycotting. Your father doesn't know what to do. Blake still insists it's all a misunderstanding, but... She trailed off, her voice breaking. I nodded quietly. I knew it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was justice. The kind Grandpa used to talk about. The kind that always comes when greed replaces heart. But I didn't feel triumphant. Watching Dawson Grill implode wasn't victory. It was grief. I'd spent years trying to save that legacy, fighting to remind Dad and Blake what it truly meant. Now it was too far gone. The fall of Dawson Grill was inevitable. It wasn't just about bad food or shady imports. It was about arrogance. About forgetting that customers are people, not numbers. About ignoring that reputation is fragile, built not on profits, but on trust. As Arthur's legacy grew into a beacon of hope, Dawson Grill faded into a cautionary tale. And in that contrast, the truth was undeniable. Grandpa's values weren't outdated. They were eternal. The call came on a gray afternoon while I was in the Virginia Beach location checking a shipment of fresh fish. My phone buzzed, and when I saw my father's name flash across the screen, my first instinct was to let it ring out. For years he had dismissed me, mocked me, erased me. What could he possibly want now? But curiosity won. I answered. His voice, once booming with arrogance, now came through rough and frayed. "Wyatt," he rasped, "what have you done? You've destroyed this family." For a moment, I was stunned. Destroyed the family? After everything, that's what, he thought. "What are you talking about?" I asked, forcing my tone to stay calm. "You turned the press against us," he snapped. "You built that restaurant to compete, to prove me wrong. You've betrayed your own blood." My grip tightened around the phone. Betrayal. The word cut deep, but not in the way he intended. "Dad," I said evenly, my voice cold. "I didn't betray this family. You did. You betrayed Grandpa the day you chose money over integrity." And before he could reply, I hung up. Days later, it was Blake who called. This time, his voice was stripped of its old bravado. He sounded like a child, not the smug twin who once mocked me in boardrooms. "Wyatt, you have to help us," he pleaded. "The company's collapsing. Dad doesn't know what to do. I can't handle it." Silence stretched between us as I let his words sink in. For the first time, I heard fear in Blake's voice. Desperation. The empire he had worshipped was crumbling in his hands. "You know how to fix this," he continued, his voice trembling. "You always wanted to go back to Grandpa's ways. Maybe that's what we need now. Please, Wyatt. You can save the company." I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the counter as anger and sorrow churned inside me. How many times had I tried to do exactly that? How many times had they laughed in my face, mocked me, dismissed me as outdated? Now, when the walls were caving in, suddenly my ideas mattered. "Blake," I said quietly, "I tried to save the company a long time ago. You didn't listen. Dad didn't listen. It's too late now." And I hung up. But that wasn't the end. A week later, Mom called me. Her voice trembled the way it always did when she was caught between us. "Wyatt," she whispered, "your father and Blake want to meet you. Please, just hear them out." I sighed heavily, Part of me wanted to refuse outright, but I couldn't deny Mom. She had carried enough heartache. For her sake, I agreed. The meeting was set at a small coffee shop in downtown Norfolk. Rain drizzled outside, the streets slick and gray. When I walked in, I spotted them instantly in the corner. My father, once proud in his tailored suits, now wore a worn sweater, his face lined and haggard, his eyes sunken. Blake sat beside him, hair messy, gaze fixed on the table. They looked nothing like the conquerors they once pretended to be. I slid into the chair across from them, silent. I wasn't there for small talk. I was there to listen. Dad cleared his throat, his voice stripped of smugness. "Wyatt," he began slowly, "the company's on the brink of bankruptcy. We've lost most of our locations. Shareholders are gone. The lawsuits, they're killing us." He stopped, searching my face for sympathy. I gave him none. Blake jumped in, his voice desperate. "Wyatt, you can help us. Arthur's legacy is thriving. You could buy the company or loan us enough to recover. This is the family legacy. You can't let it collapse." For a long moment, I said nothing. I just looked at them. My father, who had stripped me of everything, and my brother, who had mucked me every step of the way. Now they were broken men, begging the son and brother they once belittled. Finally, I spoke. My voice wound steady, but cold. "That's not Grandpa's legacy anymore. You destroyed it the day you chose greed over heart. There's the day you laughed at his values. What you're asking me to save? It's already dead." Dad's brow furrowed, his hands clenched. "What, you're my son. You can't turn your back on family like this." "Family?" I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. "You turned your back on me when you chose Blake as heir. You turned your back on Grandpa when you filled his restaurants with frozen garbage. Don't talk to me about family." I stood, the weight of years of silence lifting with each breath. Blake's voice cracked as he broke. I shut it down in tears, but I didn't look back. My father's face hardened, but behind the anger was something else. Fear. "I can't help you," I said, my voice final. "Not because I don't want to, but because I can't save something that no longer exists." And with that, I walked out into the rain. The cold drops stung my skin, but I felt lighter than I had in years. They had tried to bury me, but I had risen. And now, for the first time, they were the ones drowning. A year after that rain-soaked meeting in the Norfolk coffee shop, the news broke. Dawson Grill and Oyster Bar had declared bankruptcy. The empire my father had built on shortcuts and arrogance collapsed under the weight of lawsuits, debt, and a reputation shattered beyond repair. The headlines were merciless. Restaurant empire falls to greed. From legacy to ruin. How a family name was tarnished. I read them with a heavy heart. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't gloat. Instead, I felt a quiet sadness. This was the business my grandfather had poured his soul into, reduced to ashes by the very people meant to carry it forward. Dad sold off the luxuries he once flaunted, the yacht, the vacation home, the sleek sports cars. He moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town, a shadow of the man he once pretended to be. Blake bounced between odd jobs, the arrogance drained from him, replaced by a hollow weariness. Mom told me these things in hushed tones, her voice tinged with sorrow. And though I had every reason to hate them, I didn't. They were still my family, however distant. I didn't want to see them broken, but I couldn't save them either. They had chosen their path. Meanwhile, Arthur's legacy flourished. With Brittany by my side, we opened new locations. Carefully, deliberately, always grounded in Grandpa's philosophy. Norfolk, Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, Richmond. Eventually, even Washington, D.C. and Raleigh. Each restaurant carried the same heartbeat, fresh, traceable ingredients, honest relationships with farmers, and an atmosphere that felt like home. Everywhere we opened, I hung the same photograph on the wall. Grandpa Arthur standing proudly in front of the original Dawson grill, his smile warm, his eyes filled with resolve. Customers would often stop and ask about the man in the picture. I'd smile and say, "That's my grandfather. He taught me everything I know about doing business with heart." And it wasn't just words. I lived it. I still visited farmers' markets myself, shaking hands with growers, listening to their stories, just as Grandpa once did. I wanted our restaurants to be more than places to eat. I wanted them to be communities, places where people felt seen and valued. Mom eventually moved in with Brittany and me, leaving behind the wreckage of her years with Dad. She found joy again in being a grandmother to our daughter Emma. I would watch her sitting with Emma on the porch, stroking her hair as she told stories about Arthur. "Your great-grandpa was a remarkable man," she'd say softly, "and your dad is carrying on his legacy." Those words always filled me with warmth, because that's what it had all been for. Not just to prove Dad wrong, but to prove Grandpa right, to ensure his values didn't die with him. Brittany was my partner in every sense, in the kitchen, in life, in our dreams. Together, we balanced the pressures of expansion with the determination never to compromise. Some nights, after a long day, we'd sit in an empty dining room, the chairs stacked, the air still heavy with the scent of grilled steaks. Gentlemen, we'd about just to hold hands in silence. We didn't need words. We knew we were living the dream we once whispered about in high school. Arthur's legacy became more than a restaurant chain. It became a symbol. Proof that doing business with sincerity and heart was not old-fashioned, but timeless. Proof that you didn't need shortcuts to succeed. Proof that integrity could outlast greed. And for me, it became freedom. Freedom from the shadow of betrayal. Freedom from a family that had once dismissed me. I had redefined what family meant. Not the people who shared my blood, but the ones who shared my values. Mom, Brittany, Emma, my staff, my customers. They were my family now. One evening, as I stood in the Norfolk branch, looking out over the crowded dining room, I felt a rare peace settle over me. Laughter filled the air, glasses clinked, and the walls seemed to hum with warmth. Brittany came up behind me and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You okay?" she asked gently. I looked at Grandpa's photo on the wall, his smile eternal. And I smiled back. "I'm good," I said. "I was just thinking, I kept my promise to him. And in that moment, I realized something profound. My story wasn't about being disinherited or about proving Dad and Blake wrong. It was about proving Grandpa right, about living true to the values he had etched into my heart all those years ago. Arthur's legacy wasn't just hanging on a wall. It was alive, in me, in Brittany, in Emma, and in every customer who walked out of our doors with not just a full stomach, but a full heart. That was the true inheritance, and it was worth more than any empire of gold.